Settle in and let your breathing slow, because the air up here is thin and it teaches patience. You think you are looking at solid ground, something fixed and dependable. Wrong. Beneath you is a glacier, a slow white river, still walking downhill in its sleep. The wind is quiet but not kind, and the silence feels padded, like the world has been wrapped in cotton. Somewhere under all this ice, stone is being scraped into dust, one careful century at a time. Tonight, with your Sleepless Geographer voice in your ear, you will drift across Siachen, through creaking ice, sudden weather, and the small, steady routines it takes to survive, where nothing is supposed to. You are on the roof of a complicated argument between mountains and sky. This is the Siachen Glacier, stretched out in the high Karakoram, where India and Pakistan stare at each other across ice that does not care. The geopolitics are loud on maps, but up here, sound gets swallowed before it can become a sentence. The horizon is mostly two things: ice and the kind of sky that looks clean because it is too cold to hold softness for long. In thinner air, distance lies to you. A ridge that seems close enough to touch can take hours to reach because every step costs more than you feel it should. Congratulations, you have discovered altitude, the slow tax collector of your energy. And if you listen at night, when the wind finally eases off, the glacier makes its own small noises. A deep creak, a muffled crack, like an old ship settling into the sea. You think of ice as still, as frozen, as finished. But the glacier is always adjusting, always shifting its weight, always moving, even when everything looks like a paused photograph. Siachen sits high enough that weather changes mood faster than people do. A clear morning can become a white wall by afternoon. The sun can feel almost gentle when it hits your face, until you realize the brightness is not kindness. It is exposure. Here, sunlight reflects off snow and comes back at you from below, like the ground is also a lamp. Your eyes work overtime. Your skin does not get a vote. This place looks empty, and in many ways it is. But emptiness is not the same as safety. The glacier is a surface that pretends to be simple, and then suddenly opens. A crevasse is not a dramatic movie crack, not a polite warning line. It is a mouth. It can be narrow as a handspan, or wide enough to swallow a truck, and it can be hidden under a thin, innocent sheet of snow called a bridge. A bridge that does not care about your plans. So you learn the local truth quickly. You do not march across Siachen like you own it. You negotiate with it. You move carefully. You respect the thin air. You respect the cold. You respect the fact that this is not land. It is a slow river caught in the act of pretending to be a floor. And once you stop expecting stillness, you can begin to notice how this ice actually lives by flowing. A glacier is not just snow that got bored and stayed. It begins with snowfall that returns and returns and returns again, year after year, piling up in a place cold enough that summer never fully wins. The bottom layers get crushed by the weight above. Fluffy snow becomes grainy snow. Grainy snow becomes dense ice. And that ice turns a quiet, bruised blue when it gets thick enough to squeeze out the air. That blue is not decoration. It is physics. The ice is so dense that light cannot travel through it in the usual way. The red parts of sunlight get absorbed first, and what survives is the colder blue. It is the color of pressure and time, the color of snow that has given up on being delicate. And then the glacier starts to move, not because it wants to, but because gravity is very patient. Under its own weight, ice behaves like a slow, stubborn fluid. It deforms, it creeps, it slides. Imagine a block of cold wax left on a slight slope. Then imagine it has been doing that for thousands of years. Some of that motion happens inside the ice itself, crystal by crystal, like the whole glacier is quietly rearranging its bones. Some of it happens at the base, where pressure and friction can create a thin film of meltwater, just enough lubrication for the ice to slip. The glacier, in other words, has a secret underlayer, a hidden, wet whisper that helps it keep walking. And because it is moving, it carries things. Rocks fall from valley walls. Dust settles from the air. Debris gets swallowed into the ice. The glacier becomes a conveyor belt for stone, dragging grit along its belly like sandpaper on a power tool. You can picture it like this. The mountains are not being admired. They are being abraded. The glacier is a giant sanding block, and the landscape is the piece of wood held down beneath it. Slowly, relentlessly, it scrapes and scrapes and scrapes. This is why the surface feels calm and quietly unsafe at the same time. The ice is under stress. Where the glacier bends around a corner or speeds up over a steeper section, it cracks. Crevasses open where the ice is pulled apart. They form in patterns that look almost neat. Parallel lines, curved arcs, but neatness does not make them friendly. A crevasse is not just a gap. It is a temperature trap. Down inside, the air can be colder and the light turns blue and strange. Snow can drift in and soften the edges, making it look less real. That is the trick. The glacier is always rewriting its own map. One day, a route is stable. The next day, fresh snow covers old fractures like a clean sheet over a broken bed frame. People mark paths with flags and poles, not because it looks festive, but because memory is unreliable when everything is white. The glacier does not keep promises from one morning to the next. And even when you think you have learned the surface, the glacier is still moving underneath you, inch by inch, hour by hour. Not fast enough to notice in a moment, but fast enough to break things over time. Fast enough to open a crack where yesterday you had solid footing. You start to understand something that feels almost personal. The glacier is not an object, it is a process. It is weather frozen into motion. Follow the ice downhill in your mind, and you start to see what it leaves behind. Scratches, rubble, and raw stone. At the glacier's edges, the world gets messy. Not the clean white you imagine when you think of ice, but piles of rock, dirty snow, shattered stone and gravel that looks like it was dumped from a truck that never came back. These are moraines, the glacier's margins, its scraped up luggage. A moraine is what happens when a glacier drags the mountains with it and then gets tired of carrying them. As the ice moves, debris rides along on the surface, or trapped inside, or shoved at the base. Then, where the glacier melts or slows, it drops that debris in ridges and heaps. It is not elegant. It is not symmetrical. It is geology doing housekeeping with mittens on. When you look at the valley walls around Siachen, you can see the signature of old ice. The slopes can be steep and sharp, like broken glass edges on a gigantic scale. There are places where the rock looks stripped, as if someone took a blade to it. Ice used to be thicker here. It used to fill the valley more completely. It used to press harder against the sides, carving and widening, dragging stone into smoother shapes. Glaciers carve differently than rivers. A river cuts a narrow groove, a sharp V shape. A glacier is broader and heavier. It scrapes out a U-shaped valley, like a giant thumb pressed into clay. Even if you do not know the terms, you can feel the difference in your bones. This valley was not just cut, it was sanded, and the glacier makes its own kind of dust. Rock flour, they call it, because it is ground so fine, it behaves like powder. Some of it settles on the snow, darkening the surface in streaks and patches. It looks like dirt, because it is, but it matters more than you would think. Clean snow reflects sunlight, sending most of it back into the sky. Darker snow absorbs more heat, so when dust and debris spread across the ice, sunlight bites harder. The glacier can melt faster in those stained areas, not because the air got warmer, but because the surface got less reflective. The glacier is sensitive to tiny changes, like a mood that shifts because someone said the wrong word. Wind helps with this. Up here, wind is not just air moving. It is a sculptor. It scours exposed ridges, steals loose snow, and dumps it somewhere else. It carries fine dust from bare rock and sprinkles it over white fields. It builds snow into ripples and ridges called sastrugi, sharp, frozen waves that can make walking feel like climbing over the spine of a buried creature. Erosion never takes a day off. Even in the cold, even when everything looks locked in place, you might think, because it is frozen, that time is frozen too. But the glacier is a machine that runs on slow violence. Each scrape is small, each movement is slight, but added up over centuries, and mountains become gravel. The world becomes sediment. The glacier is turning height into flatness, just not on a human schedule. And while the landscape does its quiet work, you remember there are people here too, trying to live on top of a moving freezer. Surviving at this altitude is mostly not heroic. It is mostly procedural. It is routines stacked on routines, small actions that keep you from becoming a cautionary tale. The air feels half empty because, in a practical sense, it is. There is less oxygen in each breath. Your lungs can pull in air just fine, but the air is not delivering what your blood expects. Your heart beats faster, your body tries to compensate, and your brain, which is used to being spoiled, starts acting like it has been mildly insulted. So you learn to move slowly, not because you are calm, but because rushing makes you stupid. At extreme altitude, speed is a luxury. You do not get to spend it. Cold adds another layer of complication. It steals moisture from you with every breath. You can dehydrate in a place made of ice, which is a joke the glacier tells with a straight face. Your body loses water through breathing, through sweat you do not notice, through the dry wind. If you do not drink enough, your blood thickens, your headache grows teeth, and fatigue becomes a heavy coat you cannot take off. People who work here learn a boring truth. Hydration is survival. Melt snow. Drink, melt more snow, drink again. The ritual repeats day after day because there is no convenient stream, no easy tap, no friendly puddle. Water exists here in abundance, but it is locked away in a form that does not care if you are thirsty. And then there is the sun. At this height, sunlight is sharper, less filtered by atmosphere. It can burn skin quickly, especially when snow reflects it back up under your chin and into your nose. Your lips crack, your face feels raw. Even your eyes can get injured by light, a condition called snow blindness. Snow blindness sounds like a poetic phrase. It is not. It is sunburn. But for your eyes, it turns blinking into pain. It makes the world blur and throb. So you wear dark goggles even when the sky looks gentle. Congratulations. You have learned that beauty is sometimes just radiation with better branding. Shelter becomes its own geography. Tents and bunkers are not cozy. They are defensive structures against wind and cold, and the simple fact that your body is warm and the environment is not. Insulation matters. A small gap in a shelter is not a minor inconvenience. It is an invitation for the outside to come in and take what it wants. Fuel becomes precious, not only for warmth, but for melting snow, for cooking, for keeping fingers functional. Food is not about cuisine. It is about calories, salt, and the strange appetite changes that altitude causes. Some people lose hunger entirely. Others crave sugar, like their body is trying to bribe itself into staying awake. Sleep, even when you get it, is thin. Altitude can disturb breathing at night. You drift off, then wake, then drift again, like your body is practicing for a future it does not enjoy thinking about. And for all of that, the strangest part is how ordinary it becomes. Humans can adapt to almost anything, as long as it happens slowly enough. The routines settle in. You check your gear. You check your skin. You drink water you had to create from snow. You watch the weather like it is a supervisor. There is also the reality of this being a war zone. But war up here has its own cold personality. The terrain is so hostile that it becomes a third army, impartial and very well armed. Equipment fails, metal becomes brittle, batteries die faster, engines struggle, and sometimes the biggest danger is not the other side. It is simply gravity, working with ice. Avalanches happen. Crevasses swallow. Frostbite takes what it can get. The glacier does not choose sides. It just continues. So survival becomes a checklist you repeat until it feels like prayer. Stay warm, stay dry, cover your eyes, eat enough, drink enough. Move carefully. Do not rush. Do not trust fresh snow. Do not trust silence. From those tiny human routines, let your thoughts widen again. Because the cold here is not just weather, it is geography. Cold is not simply a temperature on a forecast. It is a force that shapes what can exist. It decides which materials behave and which ones fail. It decides how fast ice moves. It decides whether snow becomes a stable layer or a dangerous slab waiting to slide. On Siachen, you feel how cold changes the meaning of time. A small task takes longer. A simple walk becomes a negotiation. Even speaking can feel expensive because opening your mouth lets warmth escape. Breath turns to crystals on fabric. Your own exhalation tries to become part of the landscape. And yet, the glacier keeps going. It does not speed up because you are tired. It does not slow down because you are impressed. It just flows, carrying its rocks, carving its valley, grinding its flour. You can almost sense the direction of movement if you pay attention to the surface patterns. The stretched lines, the pressure ridges, the way debris bands curve like fingerprints. The glacier is writing its story in textures. And then, without warning, the sky can decide to erase the page. Storms here do not always arrive politely. They can roll in like a curtain being pulled across a stage, turning distance into nothing. One moment you can see ridges layered against the horizon. The next moment, the world ends a few steps away. Whiteout is not a color. It is the absence of reference. Up becomes unclear. Down becomes a guess. The ground and sky merge into one blank surface, and your body loses its usual confidence. But we will move into that weather gently when it comes, because on this glacier, even the storms have their own patterns and their own reasons, and they do not appear out of nowhere. For now, you stay with the steady creak of ice and the knowledge that the next change can be carried in on a quiet wind. It starts as a soft, dimming, like someone lowering a lamp in the next room. A smudge of cloud slides over the ridgeline, and suddenly the light changes texture. The snow stops glittering and begins to look like chalk. The wind that was merely present becomes interested in you, probing for gaps in fabric, testing seams, tugging at loose straps like a bored animal with teeth. You might assume a storm up here is just weather, random, rude, and temporary. Wrong. A storm in the Karakoram is geography doing administration. The mountains file paperwork in the sky, and you are standing at the in tray. The first flakes are small and dry, almost polite. They don't melt when they land on you. They just accumulate, grain by grain, building a new surface on top of the old one. It's how this place edits itself, quietly, constantly, without consulting the people trying to draw straight lines across it. And when the curtain fully drops, the world becomes depthless. Not dark, just blank. Your eyes search for contrast and find none. You realize how much of your balance depends on seeing edges. When there are no edges, your body becomes unsure of its own authority. The practical problem is simple. Without reference points, you can walk in circles and swear you were moving straight. The emotional problem is also simple. You begin to understand that the glacier doesn't need to chase you. It only needs to let you get lost. So humans cheat. They plant bamboo poles and flags. They scratch routes into their memory. They tie lines between points like children tying string through a maze. They create a handmade geometry because the natural geometry is too patient to be helpful. Even the snow has opinions about your path. Wind packs it into hard ridges and then scours it off again. Sometimes it lays down a smooth, innocent layer that looks safe, and underneath it is a slab of older snow, dense and slick, waiting to slide as one piece. That is how avalanches start in a lot of places, not with dramatic chaos, but with layering, like a badly built cake. You learn to read the surface the way you read someone's face. This drift looks pillowy, so it might be newly fallen. That ridge looks polished, so wind has been sanding it for hours. That hollow looks too smooth, so maybe it is hiding a fracture. You do not get certainty, you get clues. And still, the wind keeps moving. It is not the roaring wind of a movie. Sometimes it is worse than that. Sometimes it is a steady, dry rasp, the sound of sandpaper on wood. Loose snow skitters across the surface in thin sheets, like the glacier has decided to grow fur and then immediately comb it flat. This is what high-altitude storms often do. They don't always bring a lot of snow at once. They bring transport. They pick up what fell yesterday and relocate it. They build drifts in the wrong places, filling trenches and burying gear. They carve down to old ice on exposed slopes, making them slick and hard. They are not simply adding snow. They are rearranging it, like a restless houseguest moving furniture at 3 in the morning. Temperature in a storm can be deceptive. The sky goes flat, the sun disappears, and you might think it will get warmer. Sometimes it does slightly, because clouds act like a blanket. They trap some of the heat, trying to escape. But the wind steals that advantage immediately, and wind chill turns any exposed skin into a countdown. Your eyelashes gather frost. Your breath crystallizes on your mask, and then you are wearing your own weather. Fabric stiffens. Zippers become stubborn. Plastic turns brittle, and suddenly the smallest piece of broken gear becomes an entire problem. Congratulations! You have reached the stage where maintenance is not a hobby. It is survival, and it is deeply boring. The cold is dry, and dryness is a hidden cruelty. In humid cold, snow sticks and clumps. In dry cold, snow is powder that infiltrates everything. It gets into folds, seams, pockets, and then melts slightly from your body heat and refreezes like glue. The glacier does not bite you once. It nibbles you all day. And while you deal with this, the storm keeps doing its bigger job. It is building load on slopes. It is depositing snow where it can't bond well to what's underneath. It is creating the conditions for a later release. Avalanches are often delayed. The storm writes the setup, and the punchline arrives when the sky is already clear again. That is what makes avalanche terrain feel like a cruel joke. The dangerous moment might be a sunny afternoon with blue sky and sparkling snow. The storm is gone. Everyone relaxes. And then the snowpack, with all its layers and weak points, decides it cannot hold itself anymore. In a place like Siachen, avalanches are part of the background. They come down off steep valley walls where gravity has been waiting patiently. Snow and ice detach, and the whole slope becomes motion. The sound can be distant, a low thunder that you feel more than hear, or it can be close enough to make you understand instantly what it means for a mountain to move. The avalanche does not need malice. It has mass. That is enough. If you are unlucky, it hits you directly. If you are luckier, it hits your route, buries your markers, and changes the surface you thought you knew. It fills crevasses. It smooths hazards into invisible shapes. It can make travel easier for a while, and then suddenly, much worse, because the new snow settles and cracks, and the glacier resumes its slow habit of opening its mouth. So, when the storm thickens, you feel the world shrink. You focus on the few meters around you. The sound is muted, like your ears are stuffed with wool. The only sharp noise is the wind, worrying at hard edges, and the occasional pop of ice shifting under stress. You might wonder why this region gets such violent mood swings. why it can be clear and cruel in the morning and then blind by midday, why the sky seems to change its mind so quickly. It is because you are standing in a machine made of mountains. The Karakoram is not just a range. It is a wall, and it forces air to behave. When wind pushes moist air toward high terrain, the air cannot go through the rock, so it goes up. Rising air expands and cools. Cool air cannot hold as much water vapor, so the vapor condenses into cloud and then into snow. This is orographic lift, a technical term that means the mountains make the sky climb, and the sky drops what it was carrying along the way. The interesting part is that the Karakoram is fed by more than one weather system. In winter, storms can come from the west, carried by what meteorologists call western disturbances. These are mid-latitude systems that bring snow into the high ranges. In summer, the wider region is influenced by the monsoon, though the highest, coldest parts see that moisture in complicated, uneven ways. So you end up with a place that can accumulate snow across seasons. That is the key to glaciers. Not just cold, but cold plus supply. A glacier is like a bank account that stays solvent because deposits keep coming. But deposits are never even. The wind decides where to place them. Valleys funnel air like hallways. Ridges accelerate it like a nozzle. On the windward side, snow gets hammered and scoured. On the leeward side, snow piles up in deep drifts, sheltered, stored, and sometimes dangerously unstable. You can feel those differences under your boots. On one side of a ridge, you crunch through powder. On the other side, you hit a hard crust that rings faintly, like tapping ceramic. Same storm, same altitude, different reality, shaped by a subtle curve in the land. Even temperature is not uniform. Shade matters. A slope facing the sun warms up more. Even when the air stays cold, the snow there can become sticky in daylight, then refreeze at night into a slick glaze. A slope in permanent shadow stays colder and keeps its snow lighter, weaker, more prone to sudden collapse when loaded. So the glacier is never just one condition. It is a patchwork of microclimates stitched together by wind, sun, and rock. When the storm finally begins to thin, it doesn't leave all at once. It frays at the edges. The horizon returns in pieces. A darker shape suggests a ridge. A faint line suggests a valley wall. Depth comes back like a slow memory. And the first clear gap in cloud is often worse for your eyes than the storm itself. Light floods in, hard and white, and everything you look at reflects it. The snow becomes a mirror for the sky. You understand why goggles feel like medical equipment, not gear. Above you, the sky turns that high-altitude blue that looks almost artificial. It is not. It is the result of thin air and scattered light. There is less atmosphere to soften anything. Edges look sharper. Shadows look darker. It's a world with the contrast turned up, as if the planet is trying to show off its textures. But the clear sky is not peace. Clear sky at night means radiational cooling. Heat escapes upward, unblocked by clouds. The surface temperature drops even further. The next morning, the snow is harder. The air bites deeper, and any meltwater from the previous day is now locked into ice. that can make footing treacherous. So you never really get a gentle day. You get a different kind of difficulty. This is the rhythm, storm, rearrangement, clearing, refreeze. Again and again, the glacier gets remodeled. Humans build routines to cope, and the weather treats those routines as suggestions. And behind all of this, behind storm tracks and wind corridors, there is the larger reason you are standing on a glacier in the first place. The mountains themselves are an argument written in stone. You are in the Karakoram, one of the most aggressively vertical places on Earth. The peaks here don't rise politely. They erupt out of the crust like shattered teeth. You might think you are looking at timeless monuments. Wrong again. You are looking at the fresh bruises of a collision that is still happening. Long ago, the Indian Plate was its own traveler, moving north across an ocean that no longer exists. It drifted the way tectonic plates do, not like a car on a road, but like a heavy table being shoved across a thick carpet. Slow, stubborn, inevitable. When it finally met Eurasia, it could not simply slide under neatly. Continental crust is buoyant, too light to sink easily. So the plates crumpled. The crust shortened and thickened. Rock that used to be seabed got lifted into thin air. Layers folded like fabric pushed against a wall. This is how you get the high ranges, the Himalaya, the Karakoram, the Pamir. Different knots in the same long collision zone. If you could speed up time, you would see the land wrinkle. You would see faults slip in sudden jerks, releasing earthquakes. You would see whole blocks of rock rise and rotate. You would see valleys deepen as rivers and glaciers cut down, and peaks keep rising in response, like a stubborn person refusing to sit down. The Karakoram is particularly dramatic because it is a junction of multiple tectonic influences. It is a place where different faults and sutures meet, where old crustal pieces have been stitched together. That is why the geology is so complex. It is not one clean story. It is a messy anthology, and glaciers thrive in messy, high places. Because uplift creates altitude, and altitude creates cold, and cold allows snow to persist. The mountains build the stage, and the climate supplies the props. But there is another twist. In much of the world, glaciers are retreating quickly. In the Karakoram, some glaciers have behaved differently, with pockets of stability or even slight advances in certain periods. Scientists call this the Karakoram anomaly, and it has many possible contributing causes: regional precipitation patterns, debris cover on ice, local temperature trends, and the complicated way these valleys trap and shade glaciers. Debris cover matters more than you'd expect. A thin dusting darkens ice and speeds melt, but a thick layer of rock can insulate like a blanket. In some places, glaciers under heavy debris melt more slowly than clean ice nearby. So you get a strange landscape where the glacier looks dirty, even ugly. And that dirt is part of what keeps it alive. It is not romantic. It is more like the glacier survives by wearing armor made of its own scraped-up mountains. As you move through this terrain in your mind, you start to feel how the ridgelines shape everything. They steer wind, they shade valleys, they trap storms on one side and starve the other. They decide where snow accumulates enough to become ice, and where it blows away into nothing. Some slopes are like savings accounts, storing winter after winter of snowfall. Others are like leaky pockets. Even if snow falls there, It doesn't stay. It sublimates, turning from solid to vapor in dry air. Or it gets blown away, grain by grain, until the rock is bare again. This is why glaciers can sit next to sunlit rock, not because the climate is inconsistent, but because the geography is precise. The land is constantly negotiating with the sky. And while you are thinking about this, about the way the planet builds mountain walls and then dresses them in ice, you remember that the land is still moving now. The collision did not end. The Indian plate is still pushing north. The mountains are still being squeezed and lifted. It is slow, yes. It is always slow. But slow does not mean stopped. If you had the right instruments, you could measure it. A few millimeters a year, a little more here, a little less there, depending on the fault systems. It's the pace of fingernails growing. It's the pace of a city's old buildings settling. It feels harmless until you remember it has been doing this for millions of years. This is how you get altitude that steals your breath. This is how you get steep slopes that shed avalanches. This is how you get valleys so deep they catch shadows like water. And because the crust is under stress, it sometimes releases that stress. Not often, but always potentially. Earthquakes are the background possibility in ranges like this. The way a cracked ceiling is always one more vibration away from dropping dust. You do not usually feel earthquakes on the glacier. The ice itself can absorb and muffle small motions, and the human presence is so focused on immediate dangers, cold, wind, altitude, that deep geology feels abstract. Until it doesn't. A strong quake in a high range can trigger landslides and ice avalanches. It can fracture seracs, those unstable towers of ice that cling to steep sections like frozen city blocks. It can reroute meltwater streams inside the glacier, changing internal plumbing that no one sees. The glacier is a temporary skin over ancient stone, but the skin and the stone speak to each other. Pressure changes in rock can affect slopes. Slope failures can dump debris onto ice. Debris can change melt rates. Meltwater can lubricate the base and alter flow. Everything is connected, just slowly enough that you can pretend it isn't. If you could see the rocks beneath the ice, you would see long memories, layers bent like taffy, minerals recrystallized under pressure and heat, bands of different colors where chemistry changed during metamorphism. Some of these rocks began as sediments in an ocean. Now they sit under a glacier, listening to wind. It is hard not to find that mildly ridiculous. The planet does not keep things in their assigned places. Ocean becomes mountain. Mountain becomes dust. Dust becomes sediment. Sediment becomes uplift. Again, humans try to draw borders across this, as if lines on paper can discipline a continent. But the continent is still colliding. The glacier is still flowing. The valley is still being carved. And you, up here, are briefly aware of the scale of the machinery. You are a warm animal on a moving sheet of ice, on a rising mountain, on a drifting plate, on a planet that has never been still. Speaking of things that refuse to be still, you might assume life gives up at some point in this cold, that there is a clean line where biology stops and geology begins. But life is annoyingly persistent, even in snowfields, even in ice, even where the air tastes like metal and dryness. Tiny organisms find a way to exist, not comfortably, not dramatically, just stubbornly. In warmer seasons, when sunlight lingers and melt begins on the surface, you can sometimes find faint colors in the snow, a blush of red, or a greenish tint, or a dusty brown. This can be snow algae, microscopic life that can photosynthesize and tolerate freezing conditions. It is sometimes called watermelon snow when it looks pinkish, a cheerful name for something that is, in practice, a sign the surface is warm enough to host biology, which also means warm enough to melt. These algae can darken the snow slightly, lowering its reflectivity, and that increases melt. So life doesn't just survive here, it can subtly influence the glacier's surface energy balance. Even tiny organisms doing their tiny work can change how the ice behaves. Microbes also live in meltwater channels and in pockets within the ice. They feed on dust and minerals. They endure long periods of dormancy when everything freezes solid again. Their world is cycles of brief liquidity and long imprisonment. There are also cryoconite holes, small melt pits on glacier surfaces where dark dust accumulates. The dust absorbs sunlight, melts downward, and forms a little water-filled pocket. Inside, you get a miniature ecosystem, bits of rock, flour, soot, mineral grains, microbes, all gathered into a dark pellet at the bottom, like the glacier's version of a terrarium. You can imagine these as tiny skylights into the glacier's surface, except they are also tiny furnaces. Dark material heats up, melts in, and creates a pocket that can persist through the day. At night, it may refreeze and then reopen again the next day. It's quiet life doing quiet chemistry on top of a loud and indifferent landscape. Birds are rare up at the highest ice. There isn't much for them to do here, and not much for them to eat. But lower down, where the valleys widen and the air thickens slightly, you can get pockets of green in the brief summer. Plants cling to sheltered slopes. Insects appear when temperatures allow. Streams run for a few hours or a few weeks, depending on the season and the day's sun. Then the cold returns and the water vanishes back into ice. Meltwater streams on a glacier are their own kind of handwriting. They appear suddenly braided and quick, cutting shallow channels into snow. They carry fine sediment so they can look gray, like someone poured milk into stone dust. They can disappear into molens, vertical shafts that swallow water down into the glacier's interior. A molen is like a drain in the world. Surface water finds a crack, enlarges it with heat and motion, and then falls into darkness. Inside, water can plunge down, echoing, carving smooth ice walls as it goes. This is how a glacier develops internal plumbing, a network of channels that changes with season and temperature. You don't usually see the full system. You just see the openings, the places where water chooses to leave the surface. And all that meltwater does not simply vanish, it continues the downhill story. When ice melts, it becomes runoff. It joins streams that leave the glacier's edge cold and fast, carrying rock flour. Downstream, these waters feed larger rivers. In the Greater Indus River system, glacial and snowmelt are part of what sustains flow through dry seasons. So this frozen battlefield is also a water tower, a high storage reservoir built not by engineers, but by climate and altitude. Communities far below depend on the timing of melt. Too little melt, and you get shortage. Too much melt too quickly, and you get floods. The glacier is not only a place, it is a source. It quietly influences agriculture, hydropower, and daily life in valleys that will never see the ice directly. And that dependence creates a strange relationship. People fight on the glacier. People suffer on the glacier. People also rely on the glacier even if they never visit. The ice is both obstacle and resource, hazard and lifeline, depending on where you stand. At the glacier's edge, the transition from ice to water is rarely clean. You get dirty ice cliffs collapsing in slow chunks. You get meltwater channels that cut under the surface, undermining it. You get piles of moraine debris that hide buried ice, so the ground looks stable but can slump when the hidden ice melts. It is a landscape that does not like to be mapped. You can draw the boundary of the glacier on paper, but in reality, it is a fraying zone. Ice mixed with rock, water threading through, surfaces collapsing and reforming. If you follow the meltwater away from the ice, you start to leave the stark white world and enter a harsher palette. Gray rock, brown dust, occasional streaks of green where something has found a niche. The river grows as it gathers side streams. Its voice becomes louder, less muffled than the glacier's creaks. Water is always more talkative than ice, and water, unlike ice, doesn't pretend to be solid. It admits what it is: motion, impatience, gravity made visible. Glacial water often carries sediment so fine it stays suspended, making the stream look milky. That is rock flour again. The glacier's long sanding job now being exported downstream. It can make rivers look pale green or gray, depending on minerals and light. Over time, that sediment settles out in calmer stretches, building floodplains and deltas. It becomes soil. It becomes farmland. It becomes the quiet foundation for human routines that feel far removed from this freezing place. The irony is that the same process that grinds mountains down is what eventually builds the gentle landscapes people prefer to live on. The glacier makes the materials for softer worlds. But back up here, on Siachen itself, softness is mostly an illusion. Even when snow looks pillowy, it can conceal a hard crust. Even when weather looks calm, it can be setting up the next hazard. Even when the glacier looks permanent, it is always in the process of changing, advancing, retreating, thickening, creaking forward. So you keep moving through this place, in your mind, at the glacier's pace, not yours. You notice how every feature is a sign of process. The crevasses are not random. They show where the glacier accelerates over steepening bedrock, stretching like taffy. The pressure ridges show where ice compresses, stacking and buckling. The debris bands show where rockfall has fed the surface, and where flow has carried those rocks into curved lines. Even the color tells a story. Fresh snow is bright because it is full of air and sharp crystals that reflect light. Older snow becomes granular, then dense. Deep ice looks blue because it has been squeezed and purified by time. Dirty ice looks gray because the glacier has been eating the mountain and wearing it on its skin. If you stay with these details long enough, the place becomes less like a blank wasteland and more like a living map of forces: gravity, wind, sun, tectonics, water, time. And time is the part you can't bargain with. Here, everything happens either too fast for comfort or too slow for human patience. Storms erase the world in minutes. Frostbite can start before you finish a task. Avalanches can release in a breath, but the glacier itself advances in small increments. Like a clock hand you only notice when you look away and look back. This mismatch is part of what makes the glacier feel uncanny. You are a fast animal in a slow landscape, trying to survive by being methodical. You begin to understand why people stationed here talk about routine the way sailors do. Same checks, same steps, same caution, because the environment punishes improvisation. And still, the glacier offers moments that are strangely beautiful if you don't demand that beauty be safe. A clear night can reveal a sky crowded with stars, sharper than you are used to. The Milky Way looks less like a concept and more like a spill of powdered light. The cold makes the air clear, and the altitude reduces the haze of lower atmospheres. The glacier under starlight is not white anymore. It turns silver, then blue-black in shadow. The crevasses become dark seams, like cracks in porcelain. The mountains stand as silhouettes, enormous and quiet, not moving fast enough to notice, but moving all the same. And in that quiet, you can almost feel the deeper motion beneath everything. The crust under stress, the plate pushing north, the faults locked and waiting, the ice flowing, the water searching for exits. It can make human conflict feel small, not because it isn't tragic, but because it is brief. The mountains have watched countless brief things happen. They will watch more. They are not impressed by our urgency. But that thought does not need to be heavy. It can be oddly comforting. The planet does not require you to solve it tonight. The glacier will continue its slow work either way. And as you follow that slow work further downhill along the Meltwater's path, you start to sense how the entire system is connected. From snowfall accumulating high in shadowed basins, to ice flowing through the valley, to water leaving the glacier's edge, to rivers feeding lives far below. The story keeps going, and the water keeps descending, carrying the glacier's ground-up mountains with it, turning hard stone into fine sediment, and fine sediment into the beginnings of softer ground. Down here, the first thing you notice is that the cold changes its texture. On the glacier, cold is clean and dry, like metal left outside overnight. As you descend, it becomes damp around the edges, because meltwater is finally allowed to exist for more than a moment. You can hear it now, thin streams under crusted snow, a faint gurgle like the mountain clearing its throat. You think the glacier ends at a neat line, ice on one side, river on the other. Wrong. The edge is a complicated argument. It is ice buried under rubble, and rubble glued together by refreezing water, and sudden holes where a roof of snow collapses into empty space. The ground looks solid here, the way a parking lot looks solid. Then it slumps under you, because it is not a parking lot. It's debris sitting on top of rotting ice. The glacier retreats by becoming a liar first. The meltwater finds the easiest route, which is never the route you would choose. It slides along the contact between ice and rock. It disappears into cracks. It reappears where the surface gives up pretending. Some of it flows on top in braided threads, shining briefly in the harsh light. Then it drops into a dark opening, and you only hear it after echoing inside the glacier. When water falls into the ice like that, it is not just traveling, it is working. Water carries heat. Even when it feels freezing to your fingers, it is warmer than the ice around it. That difference is enough. It melts channels, enlarges fractures, and carves smooth tubes through the glacier's body. By late season, a glacier can become a layered plumbing system. Surface streams, internal conduits, and subglacial flow that runs along bedrock. None of it is permanent. It all rearranges every year, like a city rebuilding its sewer lines in the dark. And this is where the milky color begins to make sense. Glacial runoff looks pale because it is carrying ground rock, suspended so fine it behaves like smoke in water. The particles are tiny, sharp-edged, freshly made. They scatter light, turning the stream into liquid stone. If you drink it unfiltered, it tastes like you lost an argument with a gravel road. This rock flower does not stay in the water forever. The river is fast now, noisy, confident, but it slows in wider sections and the sediment starts to settle, grain by grain. Over long time, this builds flat places, bars, floodplains, gentle terraces. You like flat places. Humans always do. Flat places feel like control. Congratulations. You are admiring a landscape made of ground-up mountain. The river does not care what you admire. It keeps going, tugged downhill by gravity like an endless errand. It picks up more water from side valleys, more sediment from slope failures, more energy as it drops. Even in a region full of ice, water is the more restless character. Now, because this is the high Karakoram, the river's story is never simple. It is not just meltwater in a channel. It is meltwater plus sudden storms, plus landslides, plus snowmelt surges that show up in the afternoon like they overslept. In glacial basins, the daily rhythm can be surprisingly consistent. Cold night locks water away, sun climbs, melt increases, and streams swell. Late afternoon is often the peak. Then evening comes, and flow drops again. It is like the glacier is breathing. Slow inhale, slow exhale. Downstream, people learn these rhythms without calling them science. They notice the river is higher at certain times. They build around that expectation. Then, one season, the timing shifts, and the river reminds everyone who is actually in charge, because climate is not a gentle background here. It is a set of levers that move water through time. Glaciers act like storage, holding winter precipitation and releasing it when it is warm. That release can be a lifeline in dry months. But it also means the glacier is a kind of delayed decision. Snow that fell years ago can become water today. This is why the big rivers of this region, especially the Indus system, are tied to ice in a way that lowland people rarely think about. In many places, summer water arrives because distant snowfields are finally surrendering. But there is a catch, and the catch has a familiar tone. If warming increases melt, you can get more water for a while. The river seems generous. Reservoirs fill, fields get watered, people start expecting the new normal. Then, the glacier gets smaller, and once the stored ice is reduced, the late season melt declines. The river becomes less reliable exactly when demand is highest. The gift arrives wrapped in a receipt. That is the quiet fear in glaciated watersheds. Not only flood, not only drought, but the shift between them, unpredictability, the loss of timing. the end of a schedule that was built into the landscape. And here, you are still high enough to see how a schedule gets written. Snowfall is not distributed evenly across these ranges. Most of the glacier's accumulation comes from specific storms, in specific corridors, hitting specific slopes. You can walk from a wind-scoured ridge, nearly bare, into a sheltered basin that holds snow like a secret. These are the places that become the glacier's savings accounts, the deep storerooms of winter. The avalanche chutes feed them too. Avalanches are not just disasters. They are also delivery systems. Snowfalls on steep walls cannot stick and slides down into the valley where it can survive. In some Karakoram glaciers, a big share of the annual input comes from avalanche-fed snow. It is messy, lumpy, compacted, and it arrives with rock and debris mixed in. So even the violence has a role. The mountains throw snow down like a rude donation, and the glacier accepts it without gratitude. When you look at a glacier surface and see chaotic mounds and broken blocks, you might be seeing avalanche deposits. When you see thick debris bands, you might be seeing the record of repeated rockfall from certain cliffs. The glacier holds these signatures like a diary written in rubble. And the rubble does something else, something that feels almost backward. A thin layer of dust darkens ice and increases melt, like you already learned. But if the debris layer is thick enough to keep sunlight from reaching the ice, then it insulates. The rock warms in the sun, but the heat does not easily penetrate downward. Under a good blanket of stones, ice can survive longer than exposed ice nearby. So, you get these strange zones near the glacier's lower reaches, dirty, gray, almost lunar surfaces, where the ice is protected by its own scraped-up armor. The glacier looks like it is dying, and in a way it is, but it is also surviving by wearing the mountain. This creates another hazard that humans do not appreciate until it happens to them. Buried ice collapses unpredictably. The debris surface can be stable for days, then suddenly drop into a void as underlying ice melts. It forms sinkholes, pits, and sharp-sided depressions. It is a landscape of hidden rot, a place where the ground can fail with no warning, because the real ground is not ground at all. If you walk here, you walk like you are crossing a roof, because you are. And the water keeps finding new exits. Sometimes it pools behind debris dams, forming small lakes. Sometimes those lakes drain suddenly when ice tunnels open or a moraine dam fails. These outburst floods have a clinical name: glacial lake outburst flood. The phrase is longer than the event. It can happen in minutes. Up valley, a lake forms behind a ridge of moraine. Loose rock piled by ice. The lake grows day after day, fed by melt. The dam is not bedrock. It is a heap. Water seeps through it, undermines it, and then one day the whole thing gives way. A wall of water and sediment races downstream, rearranging channels, destroying bridges, rewriting the valley floor. You do not need many of these events to change a landscape. One is often enough. In this region, steep slopes and heavy debris make these hazards complicated to monitor. Lakes can be hidden behind ridges. Some form on the surface of debris-covered ice, like puddles on a parking lot. Except the parking lot is melting underneath. The result is a watershed that can feel stable for years and then suddenly become dramatic. And still, most of the time, the river just does what rivers do. Quietly steal the land. As you follow it farther, you notice the valley begins to open. The air gains weight. Your lungs stop complaining as loudly. The sky looks less severe. You are still in a hard place, but it is no longer the pure high-altitude austerity of the glacier. You might think this is where the story becomes gentle. It does not. It just becomes familiar, because now you are in the realm of erosion at human scale. The river cuts banks you can see collapsing. It undercuts slopes and triggers small landslides. It braids around gravel bars, constantly deciding that yesterday's channel is no longer fashionable. In braided rivers like these, especially fed by glacial sediment, the water often cannot carry all the debris it receives, so it drops it, builds a bar, splits, reunites, and splits again. The channel becomes a wide, shifting fan of water threads. It is restless in a way that feels casual. For engineers, braided rivers are nightmares. For geography, they are honesty. These rivers are not wrong for refusing to stay put. They are behaving exactly as their load and slope demands. Humans just dislike that. Downstream communities build embankments, plant willows, place rocks, pour concrete. They try to pin the river in place like a misbehaving hose. Sometimes it works for a while. Then a big melt season arrives, or a monsoon pulse pushes water up and the river simply moves anyway. Because it was always going to. This is the human pattern in mountain watersheds. You build something that assumes stability. The landscape politely ignores your assumption. And all of this water, all this sediment, all this relentless downhill work comes back to the ice you started on. Because the glacier is not isolated. It is the high cold end of a system that connects to millions of lives, which is why change up there feels so far away. And then, suddenly, not far away at all. When glaciers shrink, they often leave behind bare rock and loose debris. That debris can be unstable. Slopes that were once supported by ice begin to fail. In some valleys, you can see increased rockfall and landslides after retreat because the glue that held things in place, ice pressure, frozen joints, has weakened. Even the permafrost, the ground that stays frozen for years at a time, can thaw in a warming climate. Permafrost is like the mortar in a stone wall. When it softens, the wall starts dropping pieces. So retreat is not only loss of ice, it is a change in slope stability, a change in hazard, a change in what a valley can safely hold. And now you can connect this back to the strange daily reality of being on Siachen itself. Up high, where humans are stationed on the glacier, the hazards they face are not just bullets or borders. They are the behaviors of ice and snow, crevasses opening, seracs collapsing, storms erasing routes, avalanches triggered by weather and warming. A warming trend does not need to be dramatic to matter. Slightly warmer days increase melt on the surface. Meltwater can percolate down, refreeze, and change snowpack layers. Or it can lubricate the glacier bed in certain zones, affecting flow speed. Glaciers can surge too. Some Karakoram glaciers experience surges, where flow speed suddenly increases for months or years, driven by internal instabilities and water pressure at the base. A surging glacier can advance rapidly, thickening and cracking its surface more intensely. It can create new crevasse fields and destroy established routes. A surge is a reminder that glaciers are not always slow in the same way. Sometimes they have moods that last years. Imagine being stationed on a landscape that might decide to move differently this decade, not because of a single storm, but because of internal dynamics that are hard to predict. Congratulations! You are living on a surface that occasionally updates its operating system without telling you. And still, there is a quieter layer beneath all of this. Deep time doing its steady work under the loudness of weather. The river is carving the valley deeper, yes. But as it cuts down, the mountains can respond by rising. This is not magic, it is weight and buoyancy. Remove material from the top, and the crust can rebound upward over long time. The same logic as a boat riding higher when you unload it. This is called isostatic adjustment. It sounds like a bureaucratic procedure. It is actually the Earth's crust behaving like a thick plank floating on a denser mantle. When ice loads it, it sinks a little. When ice melts, it rises a little. When erosion strips rock away, it rises a little. So the glacier and river are not only destroying relief, they can also, indirectly, help maintain it by unloading the crust and allowing uplift. In active mountain belts, this feedback can keep peaks high even as they are being ground down. The result is a landscape that looks ancient and stable, while being actively rebuilt, and the rocks beneath you are evidence of that rebuilding. In the Karakoram, you find granites that crystallize deep underground, now exposed at the surface because uplift and erosion have peeled away the overlying layers. You find metamorphic rocks transformed under heat and pressure, showing banded textures like wood grain. You find fault zones where rocks are crushed into fine material called gouge, marking the plane where the Earth has slipped. Faults here are not just lines on maps, they are boundaries, where blocks of crust have moved past each other. Some are thrust faults, where one slab rides up over another, like two rugs shoved together. Some are strike-slip faults, where blocks slide sideways like two hands rubbing past each other. And because these faults exist, earthquakes remain part of the long-term background. Not frequent enough to be daily, but present enough to matter. A large earthquake in steep glacial terrain can trigger a cascade, rock avalanches, ice falls, dammed rivers, temporary lakes, then sudden floods when those dams fail. The initial shake is only the beginning. The landscape continues the event afterward, like an echo. That is the unsettling truth of tectonic mountains. They do not have single disasters, they have sequences. And yet, the everyday life of the glacier still feels like the more immediate threat, because it is always there, whispering in small cracks and shifts. At night, when temperatures drop and the surface stiffens, the glacier can sound like it is talking in its sleep. Pops, groans, long creaks. These are not mystical. They are thermal contraction, pressure adjustments, ice settling. The glacier is a stressed material, and stressed materials make noise when they move. If you are inside a shelter, you might hear these sounds, muffled. If you are outside, they can feel closer, more intimate, like the ground is reminding you it is not ground. This is the psychological oddity of living on ice. Your body wants a dependable floor. The glacier offers a moving platform and dares you to pretend it is the same thing. So humans respond by creating structure, paths, routines, rules, protocols. You mark crevasses, you probe snow bridges, you travel roped in certain zones. You step where others stepped. You treat safety as repetition. Even then, the glacier will occasionally refuse your patterns. A crevasse field can expand in a season. A serac can collapse without warning. Fresh snow can hide everything. Wind can erase tracks in an hour. And the sun, in clear weather, can soften snow bridges by afternoon, turning morning confidence into evening regret. So, you learn to respect timing, not with clocks, but with light. Morning travel is often safer on frozen surfaces. Afternoon can bring more melt, more slump, more instability. Then evening refreezes everything into hard crust again. The daily temperature wave is small compared to lowlands, but it matters intensely for snow. And this is where you begin to understand that weather is not just passing overhead. It is interacting with the surface, layering and relayering conditions. Snowpack is made of layers like pages. Each storm lays down a new page. Wind edits it. Sun softens it. Sometimes a warm spell creates a crust layer. Then cold snow falls on top of that crust, bonding poorly. That weak interface can become a sliding plane. Avalanche prediction often comes down to knowing the story of those layers. What fell when? What wind did? What temperature did afterward? It is like reading a diary written in crystals. On Siachen, the diary is hard to read because the environment is extreme and variable, but the principles are the same as any mountain snowpack. You do not need to memorize the science to feel its consequences. You just need to step on the wrong slope at the wrong time and learn it instantly. But because this is a war zone, humans also add their own disturbances to the snow. Foot traffic compacts paths. Vehicles churn snow into ruts and ridges. Construction piles material. Explosions can trigger slope failures. Even heat from generators can create local melt that refreezes into slick patches. Small changes matter more in extreme environments because the margin between stable and unstable is thin. And then there is waste. The unglamorous truth. In cold, decomposition slows. Things persist. Human waste, food packaging, broken gear, fuel drums, anything left behind becomes part of the landscape for a long time. It gets buried by snow, then exposed later by melt, then buried again. The glacier becomes an archive of human presence, not because it cares, but because it is cold enough to preserve our mess. This is one of the bitter ironies of high glaciers used for conflict. The environment is punishing, yet it also keeps receipts. Decades later, retreat can expose old camps, old debris, old remnants. The glacier, thinning, reveals what humans tried to forget. You can call this pollution, and it is. You can also call it archaeology in real time. Either way, it is a reminder that even in places that feel empty, humans leave traces. And those traces can travel. Debris left on ice can eventually emerge at the terminus. It can be carried downstream. It can mix with sediment. It can become part of the river's load. The glacier is a conveyor belt, and it does not separate natural from artificial. It just transports. Even soot matters. Black carbon from fires and engines can settle on snow, darkening it, increasing melt. Tiny particles, big consequences. On a bright surface, any darkening changes energy balance. So the glacier responds not only to temperature and snowfall, but also to what lands on it. Dust from deserts, soot from industry, local emissions. The surface is a collector of airborne history. In the Karakoram, dust can come from far away, carried by winds from arid regions. When it settles on snow, it can create distinct layers. Scientists can drill ice cores and read these layers like a timeline. Dusty years, cleaner years, volcanic ash signatures, chemical traces, ice cores are one of the stranger kinds of storytelling. You extract a cylinder of ice, hold it up, and see bands that represent storms from decades or centuries ago. Air bubbles trapped inside contain old atmospheres, tiny samples of ancient breath. On Siachen, drilling and research can be politically difficult. But across the region, glaciologists use these methods to reconstruct climate history, not because they are nostalgic, but because the past is the only long data set the mountains offer. And even without cores, you can read some of the history in the landscape. Look at the valley walls, and you might see old moraine ridges high above the current ice. Those ridges mark former glacier extents, when the ice was thicker and longer. They are like bathtub rings, showing where the glacier used to reach during colder periods. Some of these moraines date to the Little Ice Age, a period a few centuries ago when many glaciers worldwide advanced. Others are older, linked to broader glacial cycles. The Karakoram has its own timing and nuances, shaped by monsoon and westerlies and elevation. But the pattern remains. Ice expands and retreats, and leaves piles of rock behind, like punctuation. If you stand on one of those old ridges, you can look down at the modern glacier and feel time compressed. The difference between then and now is visible as distance, as absence. The glacier has withdrawn like a tide, leaving raw ground and unstable debris. And that raw ground becomes a new surface for life, eventually. First come microbes and hardy pioneer plants, if conditions allow. Then small patches of vegetation in sheltered spots. Soil forms slowly from weathering and organic matter. It is not a fast recovery, but the valley is always trying to green itself where it can. This process is called ecological succession. Though you do not need the term, you can just watch it happen. Bare rock becomes lichen. Lichen helps break rock and trap dust. Dust becomes thin soil. Soil allows small plants. Plants allow insects. Insects allow birds. Step by step, the valley slowly repopulates newly exposed terrain. Up high on Siachen, this is limited. The altitude and cold keep the biological foothold small. But lower down, inside valleys, you can see the beginnings of it. So even retreat, which is loss, is also creation of new land surfaces, new habitats, new instabilities, new possibilities and hazards. That is the signature of Earth processes. They do not do one thing at a time. Now, hold this whole system in your mind. The snowfall, the accumulation basins, the flowing ice, the debris cover, the meltwater, the river, the sediment, the communities downstream, the tectonic uplift, the hazards layered through it all. Then remember the one thing that makes Siachen especially strange. People are stationed on it. In most glaciers on Earth, the main human presence is scientific teams, trekkers, mountaineers, temporary visitors, people who can leave when the weather turns. Siachen is different. It has long-term logistics, supplies, infrastructure, a permanent effort to remain in a place that does not want permanence. So you get the geography of survival turned into a system. Everything must be moved in. Food, fuel, building materials, medical supplies. At these altitudes, helicopters struggle. Engines lose power in thin air. Rotor blades bite less effectively. Payloads shrink. Weather windows close quickly. So a simple delivery becomes a planning problem. You wait for visibility. You wait for wind to ease. You measure risk, and then you move quickly when the sky allows it, because later it will not. Even the act of building is altered by the environment. Snow walls get built as wind breaks. Tents are anchored aggressively because the wind will test them like it has a personal dislike. Shelters may be dug into snow for insulation. Materials become brittle. Tools freeze to gloves. Metal bites bare skin instantly. Waste must be managed, at least in theory, because leaving it means it will remain. But removal is expensive, so you end up with the uncomfortable reality that long occupation in extreme cold tends to accumulate debris. You can try to clean it. Some efforts have been made in various periods, but the glacier is large, the weather is harsh, and logistics are limited. The result is that the ice holds on to a lot of human trace, and your body, living there, becomes another system that must be managed. At high altitude, your blood slowly adapts by making more red blood cells. It is the body trying to carry more oxygen per breath. This adaptation takes time. It thickens the blood, which can strain the heart. It is helpful and also risky. Altitude illness can range from headache and nausea to more dangerous conditions like fluid in the lungs or swelling in the brain. The medical reality is blunt. If severe symptoms appear, the most effective treatment is descent. But on Siachen, descent is not always immediate. So prevention becomes a kind of discipline. Acclimatization schedules, monitoring symptoms, avoiding overexertion, keeping warm, eating enough, drinking enough, all the boring rules that exist, because the alternative is dramatic and short. Cold injuries stack on top of this. Frostbite is not always the cinematic blackened finger. It can start as numbness, then waxy skin, then a deep ache during rewarming. The danger is that cold reduces sensation, so you do not feel damage happening. Your body's warning lights freeze. Hypothermia can begin even when you are not wet, because wind strips heat and fatigue reduces your ability to generate warmth. Judgment declines. People become clumsy. They make small mistakes that become big ones. So survival here is not a single heroic moment. It is hundreds of small choices made correctly while tired. You learn to respect clothing as technology, layers that trap air, windproof shells, moisture management, because sweat that freezes becomes a liability, gloves that allow function without exposing skin, boots insulated enough to keep toes alive, but not so tight that they cut circulation. The real enemy is not cold alone. It is cold plus wind plus moisture plus fatigue. The combination is what takes pieces of you. Even your sleeping bag becomes a battleground. Moisture from your breath can frost the inside. Over days, insulation can lose loft as ice accumulates. People air out gear when weather allows, trying to reclaim dryness from a place that prefers everything frozen. And because the sun is intense, you also manage heat in a strange way. You can get sunburned while freezing. You can overheat during exertion, sweat, then freeze when you stop. So you vent layers while moving, then bundle quickly when resting. It is constant adjustment, like tuning an instrument that never stays in tune. And all the while, the glacier keeps creeping beneath. You can sometimes see evidence of flow in the way structures shift. Anchors loosen, poles tilt, markers that were aligned slowly skew. The ground is moving not dramatically, but enough to matter over months and years. This is what it means to occupy a glacier. You are building on a slow conveyor belt. In some places, the ice is thick enough that the bed is far below and surface motion dominates. In other places, the glacier may be thinner, closer to bedrock irregularities, and crevasses form more readily. The terrain is not uniform, and neither is the danger. The crevasses are not random holes. They form where stress exceeds ice strength. Where the glacier flows over a convex bump in bedrock, it stretches and cracks open. Where it bends around a valley wall, the outside edge moves faster than the inside, and tension creates fractures. Where tributary glaciers join, flow patterns tangle, and crevasses can become chaotic. So you learn certain zones are always suspicious. Ice falls, steep sections, confluences, areas where the glacier narrows and speeds up. And then there are seracs. Seracs are towers and blocks of ice that form in heavily crevassed areas, often in ice falls. They look like a frozen city skyline, beautiful in the way shattered glass is beautiful. They are unstable by definition. They can collapse without warning because the entire structure is under stress and constantly moving. If you pass beneath seracs, you are passing beneath something that is already falling. Just not yet. The timing is the only mystery. This is why glacier travel routes try to avoid ice falls when possible. But in a place like Siachen, routes are constrained by terrain, security considerations, and the fact that the glacier is the main corridor itself. So risk is managed, not eliminated. You time crossings early. When cold, stiffened surfaces, you listen for recent collapse sounds. You watch for fresh debris. You minimize stopping in runout zones. You do the practical rituals that make danger tolerable. And sometimes, despite all of that, the mountain chooses a different outcome. Because the Third Army here, the environment, does not negotiate. Now, when you step back mentally, you can see how all of these hazards are linked to the mountain architecture. Steep relief creates avalanche paths. High altitude creates cold enough for snow to persist, cold enough for glaciers. Glaciers carve valleys, steepening walls. Further, steep walls shed rockfall onto glaciers, creating debris cover. Debris cover affects melt. Melt affects glacier speed. In places, speed affects crevasse formation. Crevasses affect travel and survival. It is a closed loop of cause and consequence, turning slowly, grinding away. And the loop sits on top of an even larger loop, the tectonic engine that built the range. When you imagine the Indian plate continuing to push north, you can picture the crust compressing like a slow traffic jam. Rock is forced upward along faults. In the deep crust, heat and pressure make rock behave plastically, flowing over geologic time. Above, brittle rock fractures and slips. This vertical motion creates new elevation, which creates new cold zones, which allows new ice accumulation, which increases erosion, which can influence uplift. The planet loves feedback systems. They are the closest thing it has to personality. And because the Karakoram is so high, it also influences climate beyond its own slopes. Mountains force air to rise, cool, and drop precipitation. They create rain shadows on the leeward side, regions that become drier because the moisture was wrung out on the windward side. In the broader context, the Himalaya and adjacent ranges shape monsoon patterns and mid-latitude storm tracks. You are not just on a glacier. You are on part of a climate machine that affects a continent. It is an odd thought, standing on ice and realizing you are part of what steers clouds. But even without that scale, the immediate weather remains the most intimate teacher. You learn the look of cirrus clouds thickening, signaling a change. You learn how wind shifts in a valley can precede a storm. You learn that calm can be temporary and that a clear sky can mean brutal night cold. You learn that snow underfoot can sound different, hollow in places where a bridge spans a crevasse, dense where wind has packed it, squeaky when temperatures are very low. That squeak is a real phenomenon. At very cold temperatures, snow crystals are stiff and dry. When you compress them, they fracture and rub, producing a high-pitched squeal. It is the sound of cold so deep the snow cannot soften. It is the glacier's way of telling you the thermometer is not necessary. And then, in warmer hours, snow becomes quieter, softer, more willing to deform. That is when post-holing happens. Your leg punching through crust into softer layers beneath. A sudden lurch that drains energy. It is exhausting and mildly humiliating, which is often how nature keeps you humble. So even walking becomes a conversation with temperature. And if you keep following the Meltwater story, you eventually reach a point where the river is no longer only glacial. It becomes a true mountain river, fed by many sources: snowfields, springs, rain, small tributaries. But the glacial signature remains in the sediment, in the seasonal pulse, in the coldness of the water even under sun. This is where downstream dependence becomes visible in a practical way. In arid and semi-arid parts of the Indus Basin, water management is life management. Irrigation schedules follow seasonal flows. Hydropower output depends on river volume. Cities and farms rely on timing. When the high mountains shift their timing, the lowlands feel it. A warmer spring can bring earlier melt. Shifting peak flows earlier. That can cause water to arrive before crops need it most, then decline when demand rises. A year with low snowfall can reduce summer flow. A year with heavy snowfall and rapid warming can increase flood risk. So the glacier is not just a frozen relic. It is an active part of an economic and ecological system. Even if you never see it, you live downstream of it, in a sense. And that brings you back to the strange idea of borders on ice. Siachen sits in a region where mapping itself becomes a political act. High mountains and glaciers were historically less precisely surveyed. Lines on maps were drawn through vague terrain, sometimes ending at a point described with words rather than coordinates. In the past, Some map lines were left undefined beyond certain points because the terrain seemed too hostile to matter. The assumption was that no one would go there. Congratulations, you have discovered how wrong humans can be about what matters. When strategic concerns changed, the undefined became contested, and the glacier became occupied. Geography, once ignored, became central. This is a pattern in many remote regions. Harsh landscapes are often treated as empty buffers until technology and politics make them accessible and valuable. Then the very harshness becomes part of the conflict because logistics limit what can be held and how. On Siachen, the environment imposes costs that are constant. Supplying high posts is expensive and dangerous. Casualties can come from exposure and accidents as much as from conflict. The glacier extracts payment daily, regardless of intention. So the war zone is also a lesson in environmental friction. The terrain slows everything. The weather limits windows. The altitude weakens bodies. The ice damages machines. The cold preserves mistakes. It is not dramatic in a single moment. It is a grind. And the grind mirrors the glacier's own grind. The ice grinds rock. The cold grinds human stamina. The mountains grind weather into storms. The river grinds sediment into finer grains. Everything here is a milling process, producing smaller and smaller pieces over time. Even your sense of scale gets ground down. At first, you think in big landmarks, peaks, ridges, valleys. Then, living here, you think in micro-terrain, wind lips, drift edges, hidden cracks, sun angles, the way a shadow line moves across a slope. Your world becomes a few meters wide because that is where survival happens. The grand landscape remains, indifferent and beautiful, but your attention is narrowed to the small details that keep you upright. This narrowing is not a failure, it is adaptation. In extreme environments, the mind becomes practical. It focuses on immediate systems: heat, water, shelter, route. Philosophical thoughts happen only when you are safe enough to have spare energy. And at night, when you finally do, you might look at the glacier under moonlight and feel something like reverence. Not for the conflict, not for the suffering, but for the sheer persistence of processes. The glacier is older than the current arguments. It has been flowing through colder centuries, through warmer centuries, through storms that no one recorded. It has carried boulders like toys. It has carved the valley with a patience that is almost insulting. It will keep doing it too, for as long as the climate allows. And if the climate changes enough, the glacier will shrink and the valley will shift into a different phase. More rockfall, more unstable debris, more meltwater variability, more exposed ground. The landscape does not end, it transitions, which is why it is useful to think of Siachen not as a single frozen place, but as a moving part of a moving range, a chapter in a longer mountain story. And there are other chapters nearby, written in different materials. Because just beyond the ice, in the broader Karakoram and western Himalaya, you find high cold deserts where precipitation is scarce and wind becomes the main sculptor. You find valleys where rivers cut through loose sediments deposited by ancient lakes. You find slopes where permafrost holds rocks in place until it does not. You find places where ice is the dominant architect and places where dryness is. And sometimes you find both in the same valley, side by side, glacier tongues descending into arid terrain, surrounded by brown slopes that look too dry to be near ice. It feels like a contradiction until you remember elevation creates climate in vertical layers. The same mountain can host snowfields above and desert below. The difference is not distance, it is height and shadow. So as the river continues away from the glacier, you can let your attention drift to those lower slopes for a while, where ice influence fades and rock takes over again, and the land shows you what it looks like without its white covering. The valley sides, stripped of snow in places, reveal fractured rock and loose scree. Freeze-thaw cycles pry rock apart. Water seeps into cracks during warmer hours, then freezes at night and expands, acting like a wedge. Over time, cliffs shed debris, building fans at their base. This process is called frost weathering, but you can just think of it as the mountain quietly breaking itself with water's help. Not dramatic, just persistent. Those debris fans can become pathways for avalanches in winter and for debris flows in summer. When intense melt or rain hits loose material, it can mobilize into a slurry of mud and rocks that surges down gullies. It is like a landslide with a pulse. Again, the mountain prefers sequences, and the river, receiving all this material, continues to braid and shift. It drops gravel when flow slows, then picks it up when flow increases. Over years, it can move laterally across the valley floor, eating one bank and building the other. If you build too close, the river introduces itself personally. And now, without concluding anything, you can feel the story widening again, back from the single glacier to the larger rules of mountain hydrology, and how these rules play out in places where humans insist on living, farming, and drawing straight lines. Because the farther the water travels, the more people depend on it, and the more they try to control it. And control, in this region, always runs into the same obstacle: timing set by altitude and supply set by snow. So you keep following the river's descent, letting it carry you into the broader basin where the glacier's influence becomes a seasonal heartbeat rather than an immediate presence, and where the land begins to look less like a freezer and more like a workshop still full of sharp tools. Down here, the river starts to learn a new skill: patience. The slope eases a little, the valley broadens, and the water stops behaving like a thrown knife. It still moves fast because gravity is faithful, but it has room to wander now. You watch it split into threads, reunite, then split again, as if it cannot decide which version of itself is the real one. This is what happens when a river is forced to carry too much gravel, too much sand, too much freshly ground mountain. The channel cannot hold it all, so it drops what it cannot lift and makes new channels around the pile. The whole valley floor becomes a shifting draft, and you, walking along its edge in your mind, start to see the quiet logic. The river is not being chaotic, it is being honest about its workload. A single boulder in the current is not just a rock, it is a negotiation between flow speed and weight. When the river is swollen with afternoon melt, it can roll stones that would look immovable in the morning. When the sun drops and the flow weakens, the same stones settle down again, like stubborn animals choosing to rest. So the river writes daily changes into the valley. Not dramatic ones, small ones. A bar moved a little, a bank trimmed a little, a side channel silenced. Another one awakened. You begin to understand why people living in mountain valleys talk about rivers the way you talk about moods. Not because they are mystical, because the river does not stay the same long enough to be treated like furniture. And then, as you continue downstream, the water's color slowly changes. The milky gray begins to dilute. The rock flour spreads through larger volumes, and some of it settles out in calmer reaches. The river becomes clearer in patches, though it never fully loses that glacial chill, like it is still carrying a memory of ice in its bones. This is where the glacier's influence turns from immediate danger into seasonal infrastructure. In the high ice, meltwater is a sound under your feet. Down here, it is timing. A rise in late spring, a stronger surge in summer, a taper in autumn, a quieter winter flow. If the cold locks enough water away, people build their lives around that rhythm, even when they pretend they do not. Irrigation canals, for example, are just rivers wearing human clothing. A canal is a promise that water will arrive on schedule, but the schedule is written upstream by snow accumulation and by how quickly sunlight convinces that snow to let go. So every year, farmers and engineers are waiting on a decision made in high basins they may never visit. They are living under the authority of shaded bowls of rock where winter snow piles up like unopened mail. And that dependence makes the question of change feel sharp. If winters bring less snow, the savings account shrinks. If spring warmth arrives earlier, the melt comes early too, and the peak moves away from when it is needed most. If summer brings sudden heat, the river can swell fast and flood in ways that feel unreasonable, because the cause is far away. And you cannot argue with far away. You might think the solution is simple. Store water in reservoirs, manage it, control it. Congratulations, you have invented another mountain problem. Reservoirs fill with sediment here. All this rock flour, all this sand, all this gravel does not politely vanish. It settles in calm water. Over years, it eats storage capacity. A dam becomes less useful not because it breaks, but because the mountains keep sending material downstream like a constant invoice. This is one of the quieter realities of glacial rivers. They are not just water delivery systems. They are sediment delivery systems too. They are dragging the mountains downhill, one grain at a time, and every human structure in the way has to decide what to do about that. And now, if you let your thoughts drift back uphill for a moment, you can see the whole chain again. Snow to ice, ice to melt, melt to river, river to plain, and plain to people. It is a long conveyor belt, and it does not stop for politics. Siachen is often described as a battlefield, and it is. But the deeper truth is that it is also a high-altitude factory, producing water in the warm season, producing hazard year-round, producing sediment always. Even the simple act of snowfall is not simple here. Snow does not fall gently in a neat layer and stay put. Wind strips it from one slope and deposits it on another. Avalanches deliver it in compacted heaps. Sun transforms its crystals, turning soft flakes into rounded grains, then into dense ice over time. So when you look at a glacier, you are not looking at frozen weather. You are looking at processed weather, compressed, filtered, and reorganized into a moving body. And that body is sensitive not just to warmth, but to timing. A few warmer afternoons can increase meltwater on the surface. That water can find cracks and drop into the glacier. Down inside, it can refreeze, releasing heat in the process, subtly changing the ice around it. Or it can reach the base and lubricate it, letting the glacier slide a little more easily. That can speed up flow in certain conditions. It is not guaranteed. Glaciers have complicated plumbing, and every valley has its own personality. But the idea is simple enough. Water inside ice is a lever. This is why some years feel more dangerous than others, even if the difference in average temperature sounds small. Small shifts change the ice surface, change the snowpack, change the stability of slopes. And when you remember that Siachen has long-term human occupation, that sensitivity becomes personal. Routes that were once reliable become less reliable. Snow bridges weaken earlier in the day. Crevasse fields open in slightly different patterns. Debris-covered zones collapse into new pits. The glacier keeps updating, and the people on it keep trying to pretend it is still the same workplace. That is the fatigue of living in an environment that does not sign contracts. And yet, as the last part of this story settles in, you can also notice something else, something quieter. Even here, even in this harsh system, life keeps trying to take small bites. Not life as in forests and birdsong. Life as in microbes, algae, and hardy pioneers that treat bare rock like an opportunity. Where a retreating glacier exposes new ground, the first colonizers move in slowly. Lichen-stained stone with pale crusts. Dust collects in tiny hollows. Thin soils begin, almost embarrassing in their fragility. It takes a long time, and it is easy to miss. But it is happening, and that is an oddly calming thought, because it means the landscape is never only loss. It is also transition. Ice withdraws, rock appears, life tests the new surface, sediment gets carried away, and somewhere downstream, flat ground thickens by a few grains. The planet does not stop, it just changes costumes. Now, let the mind return to the ice one last time. Back up to where the glacier feels like a world of its own. Picture the surface at night again. After the day's weak melt has refrozen, the snow hardens into crust. The air becomes sharper. The sky clears, and the stars return, crowded and indifferent. You hear the glacier settle, those quiet pops and groans that sound like an old building adjusting. Thermal contraction, stress release, ice shifting against itself. The whole valley is an instrument, and cold is the hand pressing the strings. And somewhere beneath that surface, deep under layers of compressed snow, the glacier continues its slow walking. It does not need daylight. It does not need witnesses. Gravity works even while you sleep. If you were to stand still long enough, the glacier would move you without asking. Not quickly, not dramatically, but it would carry you the way a conveyor belt carries a forgotten item toward its eventual melting edge. That is the kind of motion this planet prefers. Quiet, relentless, nearly polite. And beneath even that, deeper than ice, deeper than weather, there is still the older motion, the crust, pushing and adjusting. The mountain belt rising in slow increments even as it is carved down. Earthquakes waiting in locked faults, not as punishment, just as physics. You are held between forces that do not hate you and do not love you. They simply are. The strange comfort of Siachen, if you can call it comfort, is that it makes this obvious. There is no soft illusion of stability here. No gentle green pretending the world is settled. The mechanics are exposed. Ice, rock, wind, sun, and time. Humans come here and bring their arguments. They bring metal and fuel and paperwork. And they build shelters on a moving floor. They mark routes with flags, as if the glacier respects symbols. They perform the daily rituals of staying alive in thin air, and the glacier receives all of it with the same expressionless patience. It carries debris from cliffs. It carries forgotten waste. It carries the imprint of boots for a few hours, then erases it with wind and snowfall. It carries history in buried layers, compressed and sealed. If you could drill down through the ice, you might find seasonal bands like faint pages, snow from one year, dust from another, a darker layer from a distant fire season, a thin signature of some far-off storm. The glacier is an archive that does not organize itself for you. It keeps records, but it does not label them. That is your job, if you insist on understanding. And if you do not insist, if tonight you simply let it be a story, the glacier still offers you the same final lesson. Everything here moves, but not everything rushes. The storm rushes. The outburst flood rushes. Those are the sharp events, the moments that remind you the landscape has teeth. But the larger world, ice flow, valley carving, mountain uplift, sediment building, those happen with the slow steadiness of something that will outlast your attention. It is deep time, doing what it does best, being in no hurry. So when your thoughts start to drift, you can let them drift the way the glacier drifts. You can imagine the snow settling into fern, fern into ice. You can imagine the ice sliding millimeter by millimeter, carrying its grit. You can imagine that grit polishing bedrock, making fine flour, feeding milky streams. You can imagine that water joining a river, the river joining a larger river, and the sediment settling out somewhere far away, building the flat places humans love. All of it connected, none of it urgent. And if you need one last image to keep, make it a simple one. A single grain of rock, freshly scraped from a Karakoram wall, trapped in ice for years. It rides the glacier like a passenger with no destination. Then, one summer, it melts free into cold water, tumbles downstream, and finally settles in a quieter bend. A long journey, powered entirely by gravity and time. The planet does not clap for it. The planet barely notices. But the journey happens anyway. And somewhere above that grain, the glacier keeps walking, the mountains keep rising, and the sky keeps rehearsing storms, preparing the next layer, the next deposit, the next slow rewrite. You do not have to follow it tonight. You can let the river continue without you. Let the glacier creak and settle in the dark. Let the high, cold world keep its secrets for another evening, because the earth is patient and it will still be moving when you wake. And when your mind eventually wanders to the next place on this restless planet, you will already